Welcome and thanks for watching. This is a series on how to fly fish, and the idea of what we're trying to do is just give the strategies we employ and use when we're catching fish. It's reading water, flies, why we're choosing the flies, just a variety of different things. So I hope you enjoy it. This is a crystal clear river in Montana, and we had a great day of fishing. We're going to talk through some of the things we did to catch fish. Here's the first fish of the day.
We are fishing a beautiful run here. It deepens up right down here. I was working my way down with nymphs. Hooked a beautiful fish.
Alright, so here we go on reading water. The first hole that we caught fish out of, we fished a few other holes upstream of this, but didn't catch any fish, and don't know if it was just early morning, cold, or that didn't hold fish. But definitely we saw this and said, hey, we got to try this hole, and definitely paid off. So one of the things we noticed, we've got fast water coming in several different areas, but the biggest flow of that was in these two areas. And then you can see, it's not the best picture of the hole, but you can see this flat water right here. That's the deepest, slowest part of the hole, and we hit that for sure. And I think we did catch, Larry didn't catch this first one out of there, but we did hit it later in the day and caught some fish that were in there. Then I think the best part of the hole was just this run over on the far bank coming through here. There was a little bit more current, didn't slow down and back eddy as much, and it was fairly deep, probably 3 or 4 feet deep, with a fairly constant steady flow. And that's where he was putting his nymph setup, running it down through here, and caught a fish, the first fish right in there. And there were several fish in here later on as well. We caught some with nymphs, but then we also caught some with dry flies right in this upper area of the hole. And as you can see, we started with nymphs. Let me set the stage a little bit. One of the reasons is that this had been a really cold 3 days previous to this in July. Today was going to be 95 degrees, but when we stepped in the river at 7 a.m. it was really, really cold. The night before had been close to freezing, believe it or not, in July. So we look around, we get on the river, and we don't see any hatches. We don't really expect any for a while because it's so cold. So to extend our day and go ahead and start fishing and hoping to catch fish right away, we start using nymphs. Also, streamers can be an effective way to fish in the mornings and evenings as well, to extend your day beyond the dry fly hatch. Larry used a stonefly nymph, followed by a pheasant tail nymph. This hole that we started in, we had fished a little bit before that. Upstream, we found this and spent a little more time here and hooked our first fish at the bottom of that hole. We did not catch any fish until 10 a.m. And I don't know if it was just the water. It seemed like we fished some pretty decent water. I have a feeling more it was just the temperature that finally warmed up enough, the fish got moving. And cutthroats, if you fish cutthroats, a lot of times they don't warm up until even afternoon. But on this day we were able to start catching some fish about 10 o'clock in the morning.
We know there's fish in this riffle, and there's some nice size fish. We've caught them on nymphs. But we're trying to get them come up to a dry fly, and so far I've tried 3 or 4 different dry flies, had a little bit of luck on one, missed fish, and just trying to figure out what they're doing. So I'm changing flies quite a bit, seeing if you can figure out what these fish are feeding on.
We had been to a local fly shop, which is always a great thing to do if you can. They had told us that yellow sallies were going to hatch, so I really wanted to get into the dry flies as soon as possible. Alright, here you can see from a little bit further back where we fished most of the time in this run. Wouldn't call it a hole necessarily, but a run. So after somewhat of a hole, mostly the top of the run, but a little bit of a hole, this water from here down is where there were quite a few fish. And it really extended beyond this. It was a long, long run of very similar type of water, similar depth actually, and a similar flow. Just a few little differences, a few bigger rocks in the bottom, and oftentimes those did hold fish. All the way over till probably in here, we caught fish in this whole area. The most common, I would say, was over here, where it was a little deeper in this area. And we saw a lot of rises, and this is where things really started hopping when the yellow Sally started hatching. But as the hatch progressed, the fish did move into here, either moved into here or they were rising in here. A little bit shallower, a little spookier, but we did catch fish all along this run. And I would say that this is not a typical, like, wow, this just stands out, like there's got to be fish in this place. We started fishing the hole and it looked pretty good, and then we just kind of saw some signs of fish, caught a few fish in there, and then it just kept producing fish throughout most of the afternoon. I was really surprised at the number of fish that were in this run. One, because there really wasn't a deep hole anywhere around, maybe around the corner down below, I don't know. And this really wasn't all that deep of water itself, but it was constant. It was a good depth, a decent depth, 2 to 4 feet probably, maybe 3 feet at the most. And obviously productive. There must be good insect hatches in this. The gravel bottom is a really nice bottom. And so fish were just there, lots of them. Larry had caught his on a nymph.
Dry fly setup.
I started using different dry flies.
And then the tailing fly is a PNB emerging.
And I would use 2 at a time, and it just would help to kind of try and figure out which one the fish would hit. The first rise that I got was to a dry fly, yellow Sally dry fly. And there weren't really fish rising yet, but soon after that, fish started rising all around. We were able to target the fish with the dry flies, and really even take off the second dry fly and just go with the one that was working the most to make it a little bit easier fishing.
That's cool.
Oftentimes, it's a good idea to use 2 flies if you can, if it's legal in the state that you're fishing. Use 2 flies. Give yourself the advantage of trying to figure out which one works, and sometimes even both of them work. I did for a while take off the second dry fly and just used the yellow Sally pattern that was using the best, that was working the best.
12-inch, I think. On the yellow Sally.
We caught him on the dry flies for quite a while. The hatch went for a couple hours, but then the hatch slowed down, or the fish stopped feeding right at the surface.
A shiver, in this water is so stinking cold. Crystal clear. Just love this river. It's beautiful, incredible. And it's amazing, these cutthroat are right in here. It's probably 2-3 feet of water. You can't see a single one of them. They're so camouflaged in there until they start rising and come up, give themselves away. It's pretty cool. The setup I'm using right now is a 9-foot 5-weight fly rod, a dry line, and about a 10-foot leader. And I'm using a double dry setup. The fish bit this yellow Sally fly that I have right here. I'm also trailing it with a pale morning dun emerger, and an effective combo so far. I got him. Oh, fish on.
So after a while, the dry fly action slowed, but we still saw fish rising. They just wouldn't take our high floating dry flies, surface dry flies. So we were still seeing fish rising, but they just weren't coming up as much. They were just making a ripple under the surface, just at the very top of the surface, so not showing as much. So I switched to a soft tackle, which would float just below the surface, and we started using emergers. We started catching a few more fish. I just wanted to get a lower profile fly for the fish, because it seemed like they weren't coming all the way to the surface for a dry fly. So a high riding dry fly.
Finally put on a soft tackle, a little green bodied soft tackle, and that's what that fish took. So we've been watching them. They just come up not quite to the surface, you know. So you need something that's right at the surface or just under it. Tried a soft tackle, and it worked. I caught that really nice cutthroat on a soft tackle, and this one happens to be green or olive on the body, and the soft tackle is what's referred to this gray part here, and that just represents, I think, the bug as it's coming up to the surface, an emerging insect, and the fish went after it.
I would not call myself one of the best waders when it comes to walking and wading, but some rivers are really easy to wade, and this has a bottom in it that makes it really simple to wade. Some people suck at wading. I'm that person.
So here Larry catches one with a different type of emerger pattern rather than a soft tackle. It was smaller, about a size 18, and it has just a little tuft of hair, feather, at the top of the fly, which keeps it floating a little bit, but the body of the fly is just below the surface. So that's what it seemed like the fish were doing.
Stays near the surface, and you can see a little bit of it as it's going down, and that fish hammered it.
And that's why we switched to those flies. And it worked effectively. Extended again our catching time from just the time when the hatch was going on and the dry flies were active, the fish were active on the dry flies, to an extended period where they continue to be active but on emerging insects, focused on the insect as it emerges, and other emerging insects. These weren't really yellow Sally emergers, but other mayfly type emergers that the fish were going after.
Man, that's just a beautiful fish, Larry. Woo! Yeah!
Oh, what a fighter.
Wow.
The last change that we made just kind of happened by chance. The last part of the river that I want to show you is just really, we didn't find it by like looking at the water and say, hey, that's great water. We found it because we've been fishing over here all day, afternoon, and we just started seeing fish rising in here. And we're like, okay, there's got to be fish in there. So it wasn't like, I mean, if we maybe had been nymphing, that was all that was going on, we might have targeted this water because it did have depth and a good flow and good gravel bottom and all that kind of thing. But really what happened is we were fishing over in the middle of the river to the far side, and just, you know, saw fish rise, so we started fishing to it and caught quite a few fish in this area. And it did, you know, again, it had good qualities. It had decent depth, 2 to 3 feet, good flow, and good gravel bottom. So obviously insects would hatch in there. And I think the fish moved into this area because of the heat of the day finally warmed up and there's more oxygen in there. Not exactly sure if that's the reason why, but they did end up being in there and taking our flies in that area. We were fishing the other way most of the day here, toward away from where you're seeing, to the opposite side in that run. And then we started noticing fishing rising between us and the shore, which is faster water, not really a lot of holding water, not that deep, but the fish were in there rising. So we started casting to them, and sure enough, they came up to our dry flies and emergers there as well. And my theory was that as the day warmed up, it was 95 degrees, the slower water, they stopped staying in and moved to the faster water where there's a little more oxygen, and maybe the insects were hatching more in there. I'm not really sure, but they seemed to move into the faster water. We switched and we caught a few more fish in that area before we finished up the day.
Yeah, the fly had just hit the water and up he came. Yeah, it's probably a 9-incher, you know. All right, it's a nice little cutthroat right out of the fast water. Tell you, that was quite a surprise. We've been seeing them in here rising, mostly out there, but in here. So I just decided, Larry says, hey, they're rising in here. So I threw it in there. Up he comes. Nice little trout.
Unless it's a big river we tend to fish with 9-foot 5-weight fly rods. There's lots of different options, and you could go down to a 4-weight. Probably don't need a 6-weight for this size of a river. Just 9-foot 5-weight is kind of standard, and of course we were using a floating line. Sometimes I call it a dry line, but it's a floating line, and that's all we needed for this river because it was such a small river and low flows in the summertime. Because the water was so clear and the water was low, we used a lighter tippet, 5X and 6X. I think Larry used 4X for his nymph when it was under the water. You can usually get away with a little bit heavier tippet when you're nymph fishing, but for the dry flies we used 5X and 6X. As we leave, I want to say thanks for watching and good luck